Okay, we're finishing up the Shiras Devorah, which is Parak of Shayim, and we looked at the Psukim, Pasuk Chaf, that talks about the stars are fighting against Sisera, and the interpretation would be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu manipulated, moved around the Kochavim, and we see from the maba that based on the Kochavim, as it were, that affects the rain, and that actually caused this flash flood of Nachal Kishain, which swept away, did two things. It swept away, and it also created mud, which trapped all of the chariots. And then the last thing we looked at was the curse. Devorah pronounces a curse against Meroz, Ki lo bo liyezras Hashem, because they did not come to help God. Liyezras Hashem b'gibarim, to help God along with the warriors of Israel that did fight. So again, just to remind you, Rashi from Chazal really gives us two different explanations in who is Meroz. According to one interpretation, Meroz is actually a kochav, or the angel of a kochav, that kind of refused to cooperate with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Shinoi HaTeva, and therefore she is cursing a star, or cursing a planet, or cursing the angel of a star or a planet. So number one, there are a lot of questions here. The big question is the issue of free will, right? The issue is, do Kochavim, do Mazalos, stars, planets, even though the Rambam does say they have intelligence, they have perception, interestingly enough. But Bapashtus, they do what they're programmed to do. They don't necessarily have this autonomy, and that gets us into the issue that occasionally in Chazal we do come across the idea of the inanimate rebelling against God. One example is the trees, which the wood should have had the same taste as the fruit, and it did not, even though Hashem commanded it. And then the very last thing we looked at is the very interesting story at the end of Parshas Bereishis of the Nephilim. Nephilim literally means the fallen ones, and some say that they refer to angels that rebelled against Hashem. They came down to earth, they cohabited with human beings, and they produced offspring, and those offspring later became the giants, right? The famous feared giants of Canaan are said to be the offspring of the Nephilim, and according to some interpretations, the Nephilim are angels that rebel against God. Once again, you have this notion of Bechira, of an angel rebelling against Hashem. But I did mention, just to review a little bit, that Rashi totally, absolutely demystifies that whole story. According to Rashi, it's not fallen angels, it just means wealthy, powerful people who abused their position, and they took women forcibly, and they happened to have tall kids. Remember, I mentioned before that the notion of a giant doesn't have to mean like Og Melech HaBashan. If an average height, let's say, is whatever it would be, of 5'6", 5'7", so if somebody is 6.5 feet, that would look like a giant. So giants don't necessarily have to be, Godzilla-type giants. They could just be an unusually tall population. The point is, though, that Rashi deliberately goes out of his way to interpret the Nephilim story not as fallen angels, but simply people who abused their power. And the phrase B'nai Elohim, so again, if you read B'nai Elohim, that Nephilim are angels of God, then you would read Elohim as Elohim. The sons of God is a term for angels. But the way Rashi understands it, that it just means powerful people, you actually read it B'nai Elohim, because the word Elohim is a strange word in the Torah. When it means Hashem, we read it Elohim, because we don't pronounce Hashem's name. But sometimes Elohim just means powers, powerful beings. Judges are called Elohim, right? So whether you read B'nai Elohim as a Kodesh or as a Chol depends on whether you understand it as angels or just powerful people who abuse their power. So that's one set of questions. Again, I'm not giving you answers to these questions about how can an angel or a planet or a star rebel against God? How does that even work? The other thing is, what exactly does it mean to curse a planet? I mean, she says she curses them because they did not cooperate in fighting the wars of Hashem. Okay, what exactly is the status of a cursed planet? Well, we don't really understand. It might mean that the angel of that planet is banished from praising Hashem. Remember, there's a big deal. The whole idea of Kadusha. What is Kadusha in davening? Nekadesh, right? Look at the word. Nekadesh es shimcha bi'olam. We declare your name as holy. We will sanctify your name. Kishem shemakdishim oso bishmei marom. Just as they meaning the angels, sanctify your name in heaven. Kakasov al yad nevi'echa, as it is written in your prophets. This is the Navi Yeshayahu, and then this is a pasuk. V'kara zeh el zeh v'yamar. The angels call to each other and they say, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzavakos, Moloch Halaretz Kavodo. So what is Kadusha? Kadusha is the point in davening at which we emulate the Malachim in Shomayim who praise Hashem in two ways. The Malachim have two different psukim of praise. In Yeshayahu, see, in other words, it's like you only get half of the picture in each Navi. In the Navi Yeshayahu, they praise Hashem with the pasuk, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzavakos, Moloch Halaretz Kavodo. And in Yechezkel, they have another pasuk, Baruch Kavod Hashem Mimkoma. That's why Hashem is called in Chazal, by Chazal, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You see, those are taken from the two psukim of the praise of the Malachim. He's Kadosh because they say, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh Hashem Tzavakos. He's Baruch because they say Baruch Kavod Hashem Mimkoma. So together, he is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why, even if you finish the Amida, or even if you're not even davening, you just walk into a shul that's saying Kadusha, why do your legs have to be together? Because the Malachim don't have two legs. The Malachim are like standing on a pillar. Right? So we want to be like the Malachim, right? This we know from Yechezkel, our legs are together. So Kadusha is all about emulating the Malachim. But the thing is, the number of Malachim in Shemayim is really an unbelievably high number, an infinite number, billions, billions, trillions, whatever it is. And they praise Hashem in shifts. The highest Malachim get to be there every day. There are some Malachim that only get there once a year, and some only have one opportunity. You remember when Yaakov is fighting with the angel of Esav, even the angel of Esav has an opportunity. He says, right, so when it becomes dawn, he says, let me go, the dawn has come. So what does Rashi say? It's my turn to be Mekadesh Hashem. If you hold me back, I may never get another opportunity. Right, things like that. So I'm just thinking out loud, so maybe when a planet, which really means it's Malach, gets cursed, maybe the curse is that they don't have the ability to praise Hashem, to come and praise Hashem, and that's a great, great pain. That's like the Gehenna of a Malach. The Gehenna of a Malach is you don't get access to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's the first pshat of Rashi, that Meroz is a planet, or star actually. Star is the term. Although it's interesting, just as a little aside, Chazal do not absolutely differentiate between planets and stars. They actually call the planets Kochvei Leches. That means moving stars, meaning stars, like whatever, remain in their normal position all the time. Planets move, they have rotations, and therefore they may be in different positions vis-a-vis the stars. So the rabbinic term for a planet is kochve leches, a moving star. So they're stationary stars, or at least looks to us like stationary stars, and versus moving stars. And Chazal identified, by the way, Shiva kochve leches, 7 planets. Because in the ancient world, before there were telescopes, there were only 7 planets, and then they added new things. And it's an interesting issue. How does Judaism, how would Chazal view, or how does Judaism view the extra planets? Like, I don't even remember which one, I think Neptune, I think that Pluto certainly was not identified till much, much later. Does that have any spiritual significance? Exactly. How do you, because again, a lot of Kabbalah is built on the 12 zodiac signs and the 7 planets. So how do you bring in more planets there? Because you have a whole system that is constructed. I don't know. Things to think about. Okay. Now Rashi then brings a second pshat, which is a little bit simpler, and that is Meroz was simply a very prominent person who had cities. He was like the boss of some cities, a Jewish person. And even though he was near the battleground, but Meroz elected not to participate at all in the Yeshua of Klal Yisrael. Now, as I say, there's a little bit of a question. Is he from the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, in which case they were commanded to come and they didn't, which I understand the curse there. Or are they simply from other tribes? And then you can raise the question, well, Devorah criticized the other tribes who didn't come, like Reuven, but she didn't curse them. If Meroz's only sin is not volunteering, she should have given him Musar, but why would there be this curse that is much stronger? Unless the argument is that because he was so close, it's different than if you're far versus if you're close. All of this is a little reminiscent. So again, according to Rashi's second pshat, Meroz is a person or possibly the city that the person ruled over. And they were cursed because they failed to participate. The Rambam lists in Hilchos Tshuva a whole bunch of reasons why a person may not have a share in Olam Haba. Pretty bad. People get so optimistic when we learn Pirkei Avos. So we read the Mishnah from Sanhedrin before we start Pirkei Avos. Kol Yisrael yesh lem chelek le'olam haba. Every Jew has a share in Olam Haba. And we kind of ended there, quoting the pasuk that supports that idea. But the actual Mishnah is not as optimistic as this sounds, because right after it says, everybody has a share in Olam Haba, but the following things are not. And then it mentions a lot of people, and the Gemara makes it worse by giving all sorts of averos, and the Rambam lists all sorts of sins for which you don't get a share in Olam Haba. But one of the very interesting averos that the Rambam mentions is the avera of poresh midarchei hatzibor, one who separates from the community. And the Rambam explains that this refers to a Jew who learns Torah. This refers to a Jew who does mitzvos. But he kind of doesn't care about the rest of the community. And the Rambam explains he doesn't rejoice in the simchas that they experience, and he doesn't participate in the pain of their sufferings. It just doesn't make a difference to him. So quite amazingly, and it's not even clear what the makar of the Rambam is, even if the person is he learns, he davens, he does all the mitzvahs, but if he disassociates himself from the struggles of Am Yisrael, this is not just a sin. He loses Olam Haba for the idea of being poresh midarchei hatzibor. And this we kind of see, at least one example of this is the curse of Meroz, who just didn't care that Jews were suffering. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but this is, I'll say it, I will say it, because the worst they can do is fire me. Okay. They won't kill me. Okay. So the thing is, this does have to enter into our thought process. I know the issue of draft and the issue of army is a huge issue, and Gedolei Yisrael have taken the positions, and I'm not suggesting, God forbid, close the yeshiva so that everyone should go into the army. The psukim are what they are, and maybe some other time we could elaborate on it. But at the very minimum, one should feel and identify with the pain and the struggles that people are going through, and that Jews are going through. And when we have an indifference and we don't feel that pain, we are quite literally poresh midarchei etzibur. And Rachmano litzlan, chas v'shalom. The Rambam says that attitude of indifference can, God forbid, lead to ein lo chelek liolam haba. The good news is, the Rambam says at the end, that all of the averos for which ein lo chelek liolam haba, you could be misaken by chuva. So if at any point we change our attitudes and we do chuva, then Baruch Hashem, then we fixed those sins, and we have a chelek in olam haba once again. Of course, I raised the question, and you may remember I raised the question a while ago. Just throw it out to you again, just to remind you, because it is a very interesting question. Let's say a person is a righteous person. I mean, he's a righteous person. He's a tzaddik. He does mitzvos, learns Torah, but unfortunately, he committed one of those missteps for which you don't get a share in Olam Haba. So one question is this. So what's going to happen? If he doesn't get a share in Olam Haba, what's going to happen to all of the mitzvos and the masim tovim and the Torah that he learned? He's not going to get Olam Haba. So what happens? So the answer has to be that if he's not going to get Olam Haba, but Hashem never deprives people of a reward, he's going to have to get something in Olam Hazeh. Meaning Hashem will give him wealth, kavod, whatever it will be. Now, here's my problem. So let's say a person commits a sin for which he's mafsid Olam Haba, but he has a lot of mitzvahs, or even any mitzvah. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him a lot of reward in Olam Hazeh, and then he does tshuva, and now he's entitled to Olam Haba. But he already got his reward in Olam Hazeh. So what's going to be? Can he get his Olam Haba back once he got his reward in Olam Hazeh? I don't know. It's an interesting question. Because this way, it's almost better it's almost better to lose your Olam Haba and do tshuva. Because like this, if I just would have done my mitzvos and I wouldn't have lost my Olam Haba, so no, I'm going to get my reward in Olam Haba. But if I lose my Olam Haba and I get everything in Olam Hazeh, and then I do tshuva, I get both, right? I get more than that, right? So that's a little perverse that the sinner, gets double here. On the other hand, the other way is also very bad, meaning I don't get my Olam Haba because, again, whatever I get in Olam Hazeh is not really the same as Olam Haba, right? Okay, so those are a little bit of brain teasers that are actually perplexing me. Yeah.
There's actually concept of Hashem determining rewards based on future actions. So because he knows that in the future.
So he knows. So that's the interesting question. The question is, even though we have free will, so Hashem knows, meaning Hashem knows I'm going to do tshuva, therefore he's not going to give me the Olam Hazeh reward. He's like saving it for Olam Haba because he knows what the end of the story is. Yeah, that's a possibility, although it's interesting. The Ohr Somayach actually says that Hashem wills, because of the preservation of free will, Hashem wills not to know the future of a sinner, whether a sinner will do tshuva. Now, it's like Hashem closes his eyes, doesn't open them up. Okay. Okay, that's a hard question. Okay. But be it as it may, if you learn like the second pshat of Rashi, that Meroz is a person or a city that's ruled by a person, so the lesson of Devorah's curse ties into the Rambam's idea of not being poresh midarchei etzibar. Okay. Now, after Devorah curses, right? It's like Shoshanas Yaakov, right? The song we sing on Purim. We first say Oror Haman, and then we say Baruch Mordechai. So Devorah follows the same pattern that was later in that song. She curses Meroz, but now she blesses Yael. Tivorach minashim Yael, Eshes Chever Hakeni, minashim ba'ohel Tivorach. Right, Yael is the second female heroine in the story. The first, of course, is Devorah herself. Yael is the wife of Chever Hakeni. I'll come back to that again. And you'll recall that Chever Hakeni had some type of alliance or some type of peace arrangement with Sisera. Now, where is this Chever Hakeni? We don't know because I mean, maybe he's dead because Yael is the only one who interacts with Sisera. The husband is nowhere to be found, so we don't know if he's even alive at this point. But there was a peace treaty. Sisera comes to Yael. Yael gives him fermented milk. He falls asleep. She covers him with a blanket, and while he's asleep, she takes a hammer and drives a tent stake through his head, and she kills him. So Devorah gives Yael a special bracha, and it says, she is blessed among the women in the tent. So Chazal Darshan, the reference to the women in the tent, is a description of the Imahos, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. Now Sarah in particular is described as Sarah is in the tent. That's the paradigm of tznius. And even though you might think on some level that Yael's actions were not so tzniistic, inviting the man into her tent, etc., and of course she even had relations with him, as we will see. So, but nevertheless, Devorah is saying her actions is as pure as the actions of the righteous imahos. Nashim me'ohel ba'ohel tivorach. Mayim sha'al. He wanted water, but she gave him milk. Again, fermented milk. Be careful about fermented milk. It can, well, besides the health hazard, it might spoil, but it can actually get you very drunk. It can actually be an intoxicating beverage, and in any event, it'll put you to sleep, right? A lot of people say when they eat milchiks, they get very, very tired. I don't know if Sisera had lactose intolerance or whatever, but it put him to sleep, and she was able to kill him. Now, here, Devorah refers to something that's a very, very delicate point. When Devorah describes in some graphic detail how she took a hammer and she smashed the peg of the tent through his temples, so it mentions between her legs he crouched down, he fell, he lay, and she then repeats the phrase, between her legs. Now, in truth, the simple meaning of this verse is describing a death. It's not just, in other words, it just means that when she killed him, he fell. It's not describing anything before. But Chazal understand this very, very differently. Chazal understand that this is something she did before he went to sleep, and that is, she actually had sexual intercourse with him. Number one, to give him a sense of security that he's safe with her, because after all, if she's intimate with him, that means she likes him. And number two, that would also tire him out and contribute to his exhaustion. And it's an amazing thing. In Chazal Darshan, that she had 7 relations with him. Seven times. 7 times. And even though he's a guy and she's Jewish, Chazal characterized her action as Avera Lishma. This was a sin to be with a guy, have relations with a guy, but this was done totally l'shem shamayim, and Chazal understands that there is room to be matzil Am Yisrael from a milchama. Now, this is a very complicated sugya, and one could spend hours on it. I mean, Rav Chaim Volozhiner in Nefesh HaChaim basically is very much against anyone ever invoking Avera Lishma. because in some ways this was a problem, so to speak, in the earlier generations of Hasidus. And in fact, I mentioned a number of times that the great Sefer Nefesh HaChaim, which is one of the great Svarim on Limud HaTorah and the like, was written to some degree as an early critique, in a very gentle, derech eretz way, of some tendencies in early Hasidus that Rav Chaim Volozhiner was very, very worried about. And this is, to use a fancy word, the antinomian tendencies of early Hasidus. Antinomianism is just a word that means against formal rules. Again, everything I say is very, very oversimplified, but I just want to give you a general idea here. And that is, one of the great yesodos that Hasidus tried to bring to the fore is the importance of Panamius, that what is important in serving Hashem is not only the external action that you do, but the kavanos that you have, the love of Hashem, the yiras Hashem. And if you do something superficially, it just is not worth as much as a person who serves Hashem with passion, with love, and with yiras Hashem. Now, all of that is 100% true, and all of that is absolutely valid, right? That we have to try to bring a panemius to our avoda, and our avoda should not just be b'chitzonius. I mean, nobody would be against that, right? Just like you're in favor of apple pie, baseball, and what's the third? Motherhood, right? Everybody, who's going to be against that? Who's going to be against the idea that panemius of avoda is important? But here's the problem. There was a certain danger that lurked in the emphasis of panemius, and that is chitzonius no longer, in some circles, was no longer important. So an example would be that there were Hasidim who took the position that if you learn Torah and you're not thinking about Devekas B'Hashem, your Limud HaTorah is worthless. Don't learn. It's not worth anything. Or vice versa, if a particular prat of halacha was contradicting your panemius, the prat of halacha shouldn't be observed. Let's take Zaman Kriya Shema. Let's say Zaman Kriya Shema is whatever it is, 8:15. So let's assume that at 8:15 I'm very exhausted. So if I say Shema by 8:15, it's going to be superficial, unthinking, hurried. So I'll tell you what, let me sleep until 11. At 11, I will be strong and vibrant and memela. So you told me, what does Hashem want? Does Hashem want a superficial Kriya Shema at 8:15, where I'm barely awake? Or does he want a Geshmak Kriya Shema at 11:30? So there were strands in Hasidus that said, hey, come on, the 8:15 Shema is not worth anything. Do it at 11:30. It's going to be much, much better. In other words, instead of simply saying our chitzonius needs to be augmented with panemius, there was an idea that said the panemius is the only thing that matters. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner, if you ever learn Nefesh HaChaim, Shar Aleph, that's why he emphasizes over and over and over and over again that the ikar is the mitzvah, the ikar is the halacha. Yes, of course, there needs to be panemius, but if you had to choose between chitzonius without panemius or panemius without chitzonius, maybe it's not a good choice, but you'd have to choose the chitzonius. Better to do a mitzvah right even without kavanah than to have the greatest kavanah in the world and not do the mitzvah. Now you have to understand that. You read that sometimes and you think, well, that's obvious, it's become mainstream, but the truth is, a lot of things became mainstream because they came from those svarim, and at the time they were quite revolutionary. So you don't know this. You have to read between the lines that Rav Chaim Volozhiner is actually addressing a critique of certain aspects of Yechidim. I don't mean the great Rebbeim, but certain Hasidim who held that panemius was so important that diktuk in halacha simply didn't have to be. So Hasidus brought in I don't mean Chassid, but these people brought in the notion of Aveira Lishma. Hey, you're violating halacha, but you're doing it L'Shem Shamayim. Right? They would bring in the precedents. Well, you see, you can do an Aveira L'Shem Shamayim. So if we miss Siman Kriya Shema, in order to have more Kavanah, it's an Aveira L'Shem Shamayim. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner goes into great depth, or length, to try to show that the musag of Aveira Lishma does not exist after Matan Torah, meaning when the Avos, right, with the Avos, right, we say the Avos kept the Torah before it was given, right? Now, there's a whole bunch of questions on that whole sugya. Well, how could Yaakov marry two sisters, etc., right? That whole inyan of the Avos seemingly violating the Torah. How could Avram serve the angels meat and milk? And there's a whole marachos, all sorts of meforshim talk about these things. So Rav Chaim Volozhiner has a very pashut mahalach on the Avos. He says, listen, the Avos were not commanded to keep the Torah. The Avos voluntarily kept the Torah because they saw it was the right thing to do. But they were permitted to have independent judgment that sometimes not keeping the Torah would be the better way of doing it. Meaning they were able to be shaykel that, yeah, normally you don't marry two sisters, but for Rachel V'Leah it was the right thing to do. Again, there are many other answers. But that's Rav Chaim Volozhiner's aspect. In other words, any deviation that the Avos had from Torah was begeder Aveira Lishma, but he says that could exist only before the Torah becomes mandatory legislation. That the Avos made a judgment what was the more spiritual and holy pathway given the realities of our situation. But once HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, these are the mitzvahs, it's not shayach for you to say, oh, my Aveira is totally l'shem Shamayim. And therefore he was saying the notion that modern people, or people in his time, could invoke the idea of Aveira Lishma is totally wrong. Aveira Lishma is a pre-Matan Torah concept. Now, I hear what he says in Svara, but the obvious question is, well, wait a second here. The very case that the Gemara uses for Aveira Lishma is Yael and Sisra, where her Aveira is L'Shem Shamayim. This is after Matan Torah. So what do you mean Aveira Lishma is not a musak after Matan Torah? It's really a pella, and obviously Rav Chaim Volozhiner must have understood that Yael's cheshbon was different. It was not stamazai Aveira Lishma, but it was a matter of pikuach nefesh for Klal Yisrael. And even though you can't be over Gili Arayas to save lives, but to save the Jewish nation, it might be mutter. But that's a different heter. That's not the generic heter of Aveira Lishma. That's a special heter of pikuach nefesh. So if that's how he understood it, why does the Gemara use the term Aveira Lishma? Okay? It's an interesting question. Now, of course, let me also point out that this is all assuming that Yael is Jewish. Right? The whole sugya is assuming Yael is Jewish. And Chever, remember Chazal say Chever is one of the names of Yisro. And either her husband is not Yisro, but her husband is a descendant from Yisro having the same name. And Yisro converted, but they were nomads. They were Bedouins. The Bnei Yisro were Jewish. They converted, but their way of life was they would travel from place to place. And what happened was that since Chaver HaKeni was hanging around Sisra's territories, so they made some alliance with Sisra. That's how you understand it. But it is possible, some actually learn, that Chaver HaKeni was Yisro's family, but did not convert, and he was not Jewish, and Yael was not Jewish. And if that's the case, you bichlal don't have an Aveira Lishma here, right? So obviously the Gemara in Nazir that talks about this as Aveira Lishma is going with the Mahalech that Yael was Jewish, and presumably Chaver HaKeni was Mibnei Yisro who had converted. Okay. Now, the final point, I guess we'll look at tomorrow. So after she describes right, the curse of Meroz, the blessing of Yael, to Yael. She then describes, in a little bit of a mocking way, how Sisera's mother was eagerly awaiting her son's return from war, but not because, again, Devorah is being sarcastic here, although she might, I assume it's true, but Sisera's mother was not waiting for her son. She was waiting for all the goodies, all the spoils of war that he would bring back to her, the jewelry, the garments, the clothing, and she's saying, where is this stuff already? I want it to come back. It's interesting why, it's an interesting issue, why Sisera's mother and not Sisera's wife. Was Sisera single? No, yeah, I have no idea. There's no makar one way or the other. But the only woman, so to speak, who is waiting for Sisera's return is not his wife. She's not mentioned, but his mother. And we'll go over this tomorrow a little bit. But I just want to point out that, and we'll explain it tomorrow, but just to leave you with this, that the minhag is on Rosh Hashanah, we blow the shofar 100 times. That's a minhag, that's not a din. The Oraisa, you only have to blow it 9 times. And even with the various doubts, I'll explain this tomorrow, it will be 30 times. The fact that we try to get 100 kolos is because there's a Messiah, it says Sisera's mother was weeping, and there's a Messiah that she cried 100 sobs for her son. So we want to counteract the crying of Aim Sisera by the 100 shofar sounds that we have. So this part of Shiras Devorah is actually the makor of the minhag. Again, now it's a din because it's an old minhag, but it's a minhag from the Rishonim. It's not in the Gemara at all. The Gemara does not say you have to blow the shofar 100 times. It is from it's recorded in Tosfos. Presumably it started in the Gaonim's time. And not everybody, and the minhag was not universal. In the Middle Ages, there were actually kehilos that didn't do mea kolos. So it wasn't even universally accepted. I believe Bisman Hazeh, every kehila does it, but it took time. It was not an original minhag. But the makor of this minhag is from the crying of Sisera's mother. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay, good day.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.